Over the years, as you can imagine, I have heard countless stories that people tell themselves, and I resonate with Gareth Higgins' imagery of stories being shelters or prisons. Obviously, it's not quite that binary, but these two images help us understand how stories can become things that bind us or that liberate us as we live our lives. One of the stories I will never forget was told by a woman who sat down with me and said, "I've never told anyone this story before." She went on to say that her dad died by suicide when she was quite young. Her mom had left to go to the store and told her to keep an eye on her dad. But she was a young child, and when a neighbor child came over and asked her to come and play, she went and played. By the time her mom had returned home, her dad had taken his own life. From that moment on, she believed that she was at fault for her dad's death. When she told me this, she was close to retirement age. The reason she told me this story was that I had invited people to come and share a burden they wanted to lay down. She thought if she could tell the story to someone, she wouldn't feel the heavy weight of it every day. The story she had told herself over all these decades had become a prison for her. Together, we were able to transform that story into a shelter. Here's how. When she told me her version of the story, which she had been telling herself all these years, I asked her to imagine that her 6-year-old self was sitting right there with us in a chair. We even kind of shaped it out. I then said, "As an adult, what do you now notice about your story?" She said, "I was too young to be given that kind of responsibility. I didn't understand what my mom was asking of me. If she knew my dad was suffering, why would she leave him with me? It doesn't make any sense." After we talked a while longer, I asked her what she would want to say to her 6-year-old self. She said something like, "It's not your fault. Your dad and mom were grown-ups and they knew things you didn't know, and it's perfectly natural and okay that you went out to play because that's what kids do. This would have happened anyway, even if you had stayed around for another half hour, so you couldn't have prevented it. None of this is your fault, and you don't have to carry it anymore." In the end, she was able to have such compassion toward her young self that the story became a shelter instead of a prison. She was still sad about her dad's suffering without adding blame onto herself, which is what transformed the story. Sometimes we don't even know how the stories we are telling ourselves are binding us and becoming like prisons for us. Sometimes it's the stories we are told about ourselves that become our prisons and not our shelters. Our families are famous for telling stories about each other, especially from when we were kids, and we don't allow for the fact that we all grow up and change and grow. We still tell the story as though this sibling of ours was still that age. Once we can identify which stories are binding us up, we can work to transform them. One of the stories in the public ministry life of Jesus that brought to my mind a prison rather than a shelter is the story of Jesus interacting with the woman at the well at noon in Sychar in Samaria. Jesus was tired So he sat down at the well, and a woman came by herself to get water. Right away, there are some elements of the story that raise eyebrows. What woman in her right mind would go to draw water at noon when the heat would be scorching? What woman would approach a well by herself where there was a man by himself? And what Jewish man from outside of Samaria would ask a Samaritan for a drink, since Jews thought Samaritans were very low class and not to be interacted with? The first hint we get of a story that is a prison is when Jesus asks her for a drink, and she responds with her story. She says to Jesus, "Why would you, a Jew, ask a drink of me, a woman of Samaria," with all that that meant? Her question is more of a statement or a story. She's basically saying, "I am unclean in your eyes. Why would you ask me for a drink?" Rather than question the story itself, she questions him for not following the cultural rules behind the story. That is one indication that the story has become a prison. Otherwise, she'd be questioning the story itself. Jesus flips it around, though, and suggests she shouldn't be questioning him, but she should be asking him for a drink of living water. He then tells a story about himself that is a shelter. He has living water to give people who are thirsty, so they will never be thirsty again. And the water he has to give is forever. The woman then responds, "Sir, give me this living water so I will never be thirsty, and so I won't have to keep coming here." The story she doesn't tell Jesus, which the chapter goes on to tell, that has also imprisoned her, is that she has had 5 husbands in her life. That's part of the reason she's going at noon and not in the cool of the morning or the evening. She has a story of shame that is binding her up and imprisoning her. Very few of us escape this life without a story or stories of shame. These tend to be the stories we tell ourselves, but rarely tell others because of the shame we feel about them. They can be stories we tell ourselves, or they can be stories that are told to us about us. My sister once told me a story about myself. I introduced my stepdad, Paul, as my stepdad to some friends of mine from seminary. My sister was there because we had all gone out to dinner. And later she told me what a horrible person and daughter I was for introducing him as my stepdad. She went on to say that I had embarrassed and humiliated him, and I should be ashamed of myself. In those years, this was a long time ago, I still listened to what she said, and I felt badly for a while. Because I noticed I was hanging on to it, I finally decided to talk to my stepdad directly. He didn't even remember it. And he said he was not embarrassed or humiliated, and that there was nothing I could do or say to embarrass him, and that he would always be so proud to be my stepdad. A story that could have been a prison for a long time and that could have impacted my relationship with him ended up being a story that became a shelter because he reassured me of his love and care for me as my stepdad. What are the stories in your lives that have become prisons for you? The stories that keep you from life and growth and thriving and relationship and health. There are a few themes that I want to highlight that I think impact many people. There's an entire genre of stories that are told by us and to us about aging. If you have been reading the news, there is a story being told about every person over the age of 80 because of President Joe Biden. The story that is being told is that no person over the age of 80 is fit to hold a position of that kind of importance and responsibility. How does that story become a prison for some? Though there's no one here this morning over the age of 80 that I've ever heard has had a desire to become the POTUS, that's beside the point. The point is that there are those who want people over a certain age or over certain ages to step aside and declare their status as no longer able to do many important things. What a prison for so many. On our Wednesday morning calls, we sometimes share the frustrations that come with aging. One of them being that there are times when we feel much less productive as we age. And we've identified that we sometimes tell ourselves stories about being less productive in older age that are stories that are not life-giving or liberating or comforting. Instead, they're stories that are shaming or blaming or limiting. How can these stories that have become prisons be transformed into stories that are shelters? How can any of us who would berate ourselves for not being productive enough at age 80 or older turn that into stories that give us permission to come and rest when the days get long and overwhelming? Another genre of stories that are told by us and to us are about mental health. The most common story is that when we suffer from depression, either long-term or seasonally, we should just do some things that make us feel better. The idea is that if you are depressed, do something about it. That's the story being told in our wider culture. For anyone who suffers from depression, that story becomes a prison, because if you already feel as if you are underwater, barely keeping your head above water, and trying to keep two big beach balls under the water as well, you aren't going to be able to just get up and do something about anything. Some have described depression like that, or like swimming in wet cement. Anxiety is another one we tell and hear stories about. If you're anxious, just calm yourself down, is how the story goes in our wider culture. The absolute thing nobody who's anxious wants to hear. While there are tools and medication and spiritual practices that can all help with anxiety disorder, it's not as simple as the stories we tell or are told about it. If you're a young person, you are telling stories or being told stories that have to do with the kind of life you should want, especially as someone living in the U.S. the life you are supposed to want is a lifelong partner with kids or at least dogs, a high-paying job, owning your own home, the desire and ability to travel the world, and documenting everything so people can know about your amazing life. Throw in a little volunteering and presto, you have the life you always wanted. Our youngish adult group has been having conversations over these years about how to transform those stories from being suffocating to being liberating. One of the ways we have talked about doing that is by coming to know and understand what gives us life and where we find meaning and purpose. Choosing a career and getting paid well for it isn't the golden ticket to happiness. Many young people cannot see themselves stuck in the same job for decades. Many young people doubt their financial ability to buy houses and be able to travel, so the story begins to break down. Or they see the years starting to pass and no partner materializes. If your story depends upon a significant other and that one never comes, how do you not begin to feel trapped in your own life? How does that story get transformed into a story that can become a shelter? For many young people, it includes learning how to love spending time with themselves and developing close and lasting friendships that fulfill so many emotional intimacy needs. We've been talking over the weeks about the part that fear plays in our lives and in the kinds of stories we tell and are told. When fear is at play, we easily fall into stories that bind us. In the beginning story about the 6-year-old whose dad took his own life, the fear the woman lived with was that it was all her fault that her dad took his own life and that everyone in her family blamed her. As is often the case, that kind of fear ends up being even more about how we see ourselves. She blamed herself, and as a result was never able to befriend herself until we had that conversation, and she finally transformed that story into a shelter. In the story I shared about my sister, the fear I felt was that she and possibly my stepdad thought I really was a terrible person and daughter, but the deeper fear was my own perception of myself and wondering if I really was that person, even though I tried so hard to be a good person. Over the years and with some good therapy, I've learned how to do my own fact-checking and truth-telling and to sift through what family members say through my own filters of reality. Earlier, I read an excerpt from Gareth and his chapter on this theme, and he makes it a point to say, rather than using battle language for fear as though it is an enemy we need to conquer, we would do well to use befriending language. It is when we befriend our fear and befriend ourselves that we are able to do the real work of transforming our stories from prisons into shelters. Higgins points out that shelters don't battle or wrestle or struggle or cure. Shelters simply shelter. How can we construct story shelters that can simply shelter us from all of the metaphorical weather that will come our way? We cannot construct these shelters by ignoring or denying or even running away from the fear that is like the buzzing of a bee in our hearts or minds. One of the ways I have encouraged people over the years to face their fear is to tell me very specific stories about their worst case scenario. Sometimes people come to me when their fear has become paralyzing and they don't know how to free themselves from the paralysis. Early on in my ministry, I sat with a woman who was paralyzed by the fear of her husband dying. I asked her if she'd be willing to do an experiment with me, and she said yes. I told her we were going to take a look into the future as I asked her a series of questions, and she gave answers as much as she could imagine them. It took me a while and many questions to help her get to the heart of her fear. She was of a generation that had been taught that her purpose and worth was intimately tied to her husband and his purpose and worth. With him gone, she feared becoming invisible. But when we started to imagine her future without him, she was surprised by how many good things and people she saw in her life. By facing her fear head on, she was able to release the story she had been told about her lack of worth without her husband. And she was able to imagine and begin to construct a story that was a shelter, that had some hope in it. She didn't wish her husband dead after we did that, but she no longer feared this eventuality. While it's not always true, it is sometimes true that what we fear about the future can be worse than the actual future. On the website for an online community that Gareth Higgins and his husband Brian Ammons have curated, called theporch.net, there are these words: "We've all heard that for humans to thrive, we need 4 things: food, water, air, and shelter. We tend to define shelter as walls and a roof, but there's far more to shelter than that. At the Porch, we're exploring the idea that shelter also includes 3 components that most of us lack. First is a sense of purpose for the common good. Second is an elder wisdom figure or mentor who can help advise, inspire, and offer feedback. And third is a close circle of friends who share stories, gifts, and needs." I would add to that list, or at least include it, wrapped up in all of those, a spiritual community where we can hear and tell and reframe and retell and always learn new stories about who we are and who the divine is, as far as we can ever know and experience. We're going to take some time in this service to think about and name our fears. At the end of this chapter on stories as prisons or shelters, Gareth Higgins invites us to ask ourselves, what is it exactly that I am afraid of? I'm going to lead us in an exercise to do that and then offer a spiritual practice that will help us. Earlier, I read this from the book. A shelter does not defeat the rain, and a shelter does not argue with the rain, and a shelter does not feel the need to battle with the rain or overcome it. It simply makes the rain irrelevant. May we, with the help of each other, our mentors, our spiritual community, and our friends, transform our stories that have been binding us into stories that shelter us. Amen.